My name is Norman Zalkind, and I'm a criminal defense lawyer practicing out of Boston and actually across the country to a certain extent, but mostly out of Boston.
Now, where were you? You were not a volunteer at Freedom Summer. How did you hear about it?
I was in Boston. I was thinking of, I'd only been working for about 6 months when I went down there.
As a lawyer?
With a trial firm, so I get into court a lot. I was a bit of an adventurer. I had just come, after law school, I went to the South Seas as a crew member in a yacht. And I was thinking of going to Portugal for a couple of weeks, and with very little money, I had very little money, and I was used to doing this kind of thing. And suddenly, somehow I must have read about the Freedom Summer, and my boss had a connection through the American Jewish Congress, and they were connected with the civil rights movement, and I said I'd like to go down there, and he made some connection for me to go down because he didn't have the money to go down. A lot of the lawyers for the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee were from big law firms, and they had Ivy League education. I had a good education, but it wasn't an Ivy League education, and I wasn't with a Wall Street law firm. And so they arranged for me to get funding to go down there. When I say funding, I don't mean wages, I mean expenses to get a plane and to live. So I first went to New Orleans, and in New Orleans I was in the French Quarter, and there was this fancy building, and I guess I heard it was some right-wingers that they had taken for the summer, and they had these civil rights people coming down there. And I was going to these little courts, helping people out, these justice of the peace courts. And I think at a law school I was doing some research. And suddenly there was a call, and I was told to go to Pascagoula, Mississippi.
Which is on the coast?
It was on the coast. It's Trent Lott's hometown. And you know who Trent Lott is, the ex-senator. So I got to Pascagoula, there was 150 or 200 people arrested. And they went down with these big firm lawyers that I had told you about, and they were getting nervous down there, these two that I had gone down with. And they wanted to go home, not home, but back to, it was very scary, and people were not getting fed, and they weren't getting water and things. And for whatever reason, my naivete, I'm saying I'm staying and I'm doing this. And that's why I'm here. And I was pretty excited about it. And we started negotiating. We did negotiate for some basics for the defendants in a civil rights arrests that were made of really 150 people. And the next day I went to court about this. This was the court down in Pascagoula. And when I got to the court, I was spit on, and I was told, "You nigger lover." And
people along the side of the
just
road.
people around there, big people that were sort of scary.
Mm-hmm.
And I got up and said to the judge, I don't deserve to be spit on by anybody. And I was more courageous than I was knowledgeable, actually, because that's the beauty of youth, being I was 25. And so we had a real problem with these people in the state court. And that night, I always remember that night, I was with a lot of lawyers coming from all over the country. And there was a lawyer from Ohio who was a federal clerk that had volunteered to come down. And there was a lawyer that we were with, a great lawyer from New York City, big fat guy. And it was like 9:30, 10 o'clock at night. And the lawyer from New York, brilliant guy, he said, "Look, this is great. We have all night, and we can produce the papers and take these cases out of the state court into the federal court in Jackson." And the lawyer from Ohio said, "You know, where I come from, at 5 o'clock I finish work. This is 9:30, I'll be useless at this time." I said, "I'm with him." So the other lawyer was very cool about it. He said, "There's no problem, but will you take the case to Jackson?" I said, "I'll be up in the morning, and I'll take it to Jackson. I'll sleep a few hours at night because I really needed sleep." They said they'd get me a car, and that I would take and remove the cases, and I had to get to the court in Jackson before 9 o'clock. So I got up in the morning and I helped finish the papers. When I say finish the papers, we didn't have Xerox machines then. They were printing, and there were volunteers. It was in a big room, and there was a African-American law student, a Harvard law student. She said she'd come with me. So that was great. You know, I said, come on, let's go. And we went. Well, that was the scariest part, because driving in Mississippi with a black law student, this was real.
Yes.
This was a real deal. So she was as rational as I was. And I said, listen, I got to get gas. You go in the woods. She said, no problem, you know. So I got my gas and I went back and I said, now, when we drive by the gas station, get your head down. And she did get her head down. And we really, you know, we had a good time getting this. They got to the federal court, got the papers filed. They removed all the cases out of the state court into the federal court because of civil rights violations. And then they told me to stay in that area. And then I went, and I remember working in the office, and there were people from the Attorney General's office there, and Kunstler's name was coming up. He was a sort of, becoming a famous lawyer. And I was working on affidavits, and then they told me to go to the funeral as an observer for the civil rights. They had found the bodies, and there was a funeral down there. So I went to the funeral, and I remember being, and I was becoming embedded in the whole culture down in Mississippi, going to the churches, the gospel, and people were treating me just wonderfully. And they were really looking out after me. They said, you can't sleep near the window, you gotta sleep internally because you can get shot. So these
are SNCC people who you were working with?
I don't know who they were. They were bright, young. They were younger than me. They were college students.
Were you working out of the office, the COFO office on Lynch Street in Jackson?
Yeah, it must have been that. I don't know the names of the streets, but it was I remember a square office. It was not small, not big. You know, it was like second floor or something, you know. And I remember Zinn, the Professor Zinn's.
Howard Zinn?
Well, Howard Zinn. His wife was there. I don't know if he was there, but he must have been somewhere in there. And I remember the Attorney Generals, and that was from Robert Kennedy's office, were coming in there to work on. People were working together that ordinarily wouldn't work together. And I was meeting people and getting connected to in a small way, you know. And it was, and the African American leaders. Or the people that were, you know, elders, so to speak. They might have been 40 years old, for what I know. I had never worked with African Americans before. It was just a whole new, and I loved it. And it was, you know, it was wonderful. And I was meeting a few lawyers from Boston, and the rest of it was not as dramatic at that point in time. So I don't have great memories of other things except just meeting the people, going to the barbecue pits, being with African Americans all the time, plus the volunteers, plus the students really they were more experienced than us, because they were, I remember I was taken out of my house because Judy Collins was coming down, and I had to get moved on, you know, because I was not in the same league as Judy Collins. That's my story of that part of it, and it had a big effect on me later on in my life.
Before we go on to that, were there any other instances that you, as a white lawyer from the North, the South's worst nightmare, encountered in Mississippi? You mentioned being spit upon, but were there other instances later in Jackson?
I don't remember any. Jackson was much more benign, because, you know, you go to federal court, they treat you differently.
Right.
You really do. They're always polite in federal court, even if they hate you. They're much more polite.
Right.
I mean, I have had cases in Virginia afterwards where we caused some real trouble, but they were polite. That's not true in the state courts, though. If I was a little older, I would have probably thought, I better get the hell out of here, because I could have gotten shot.
Where did you stay in Jackson?
As I remembered, I stayed, I'm not sure whether I was between houses, or at one point I stayed in a motel that they had arranged. I just did what I was told. It was like being in the army. You'd be suddenly some kid would come up to you and he'd say, "You're out of here, you're going to the funeral." What am I supposed to do there? Stand outside and look for legal violations. So I remember being outside of the funeral, going inside a little bit in the back, and I didn't see any legal violations, and just standing around. But it was still very exciting. It was all new to me,
Yeah.
and stimulated me for a lot of work for the rest of my life.
Had you ever been to the South before?
Yes, I had hitchhiked through Mississippi, maybe a couple of years before. So I had hitchhiked on the way from Texas to Miami. I had hitchhiked through and got picked up by truckers, and at that time, gay people would try to pick you up and seduce you on the road. I always remember that it would happen one time, and then another time, and I have to be let off in some weird place because I wasn't interested. And it was just but Mississippi, I went through there and I saw a little bit of it. I had very little experience in Mississippi other than that driving through, basically I got on a big truck, and went through Mississippi.
Okay, so just right through the center of the state. Did you go anywhere after Jackson? The funeral of Shorter and Cheney would have been in Jackson?
I'm not sure, but it was near there, I think.
And were you sent any other place, or did you?
I was sent to some other places, but it wasn't dramatic, so I don't have a great memory of anything else, except I was so pleased with getting those cases removed from Pascagoula and working into the night, and then early in the morning, and then being down there and going to the churches and being so well received. And of course in New Orleans I also met people, and it wasn't like it was completely isolated from the rest. But Mississippi was much more involved for me than New Orleans.
Were you introduced to groups in churches as one of the lawyers who came down?
Yes.
And do you feel like you got a different reaction than the students and the volunteers because you were a lawyer?
I don't know how the students got received, but I got so well received. I would assume that I got even better received than they did. I would assume they got very well received, but I could be wrong about that.
No, they were well.
I would assume all of us were. The people in Mississippi weren't used to folks like us coming down there, and so they were very happy to have us there, and I was very happy to be there. So it was mutual admiration, really. That was going on. I was looking up to them probably more than they were looking up to me. So it was almost it was spiritual. It really was.
How long did you spend in Mississippi?
About a month.
And what
Maybe a
was
little
the
less.
circumstances of your returning to?
I just went back. I had to get back to work. I could only take so much time off of work, so I went back to work.
Was it a hard re-entry back to work after this changing experience?
It was a change, and I started to think about things, and I started to get myself more and more connected with that life. And not that long after that period of time, I was really in the heart of the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam was coming up. I became an anti-war lawyer. I had mass arrests. I represented the Black Panthers. I represented the Weathermen, SDS. I had more university cases of mass arrests than probably anybody in the state. There was 160 students at Harvard University took over Sproul Hall. I had all of those defendants. I had MIT protests, the protests at Boston University, welfare riots. My car was smashed up because when I drove down there, and it was in the riots, and I represented people all the way. And the thing was, when you had mass arrests at that time, the courts were not equipped to handle it, and we were winning all our cases. So we won 20 defendants at once at Harvard, and they dismissed all the rest of them. And so we win, and we're suddenly at the age of, in the 20s, you're in the front page of the New York Times. You were, it's like Jerry Rubin, don't trust anybody over 30. And so you were being selected to cases that now people don't have that kind of experience. And by I formed a partnership, and within a few years, U.S. Supreme Court clerks were applying to work for us. I mean, it was very heady times, and developed me into a lawyer that I became more and more and more. I got more and more experience, and I used to do criminal cases for free because I knew if I didn't do them for free, I wouldn't have any experience. So I would take these cases, and before long, I was trying death penalty cases. So it was, and that the Mississippi experience was the beginning for me.
How did it change you?
My head, where I would look, you kind of lean towards things, and that's the way I started to being radicalized. I joined the Lawyers Guild. I mean, it was that first, because remember, I came from I came from a somewhat liberal background, but not, having had that experience. So Mississippi sort of did that for me. And then I went to Wounded Knee at some point, and prison riots, and it just, all of this kind of experience sort of led to other experiences.
Many volunteers who went south were in the same situation where when they came, because what they saw in Mississippi, they were radicalized and became, if they were left, they went farther left, and if they were liberals, they went to the left. Do you think it's because it showed you a power structure you didn't trust, or what is it?
I don't think I ever really trusted the power structure. Okay, I was always sort of independent and trying things anyway, but not in kind of a formalized way. Getting a legal education gives you a license. It's a very conservative profession, but basically then I had a forum to let go what was really inside of me anyway, and so the Mississippi, sort of stimulated that a lot for me, and so it was a process, but I had to have that. If I didn't have that first experience, I don't know whether I would have gone to the second and third and all the other experiences without that. And I also made certain connections from it, people that I knew. So people knew I was, a few people, not a lot of people, but people knew that I was down there, so they would call upon me to do the kinds of things that I ended up doing. And I loved doing them. I was enthusiastic, and it radicalized me in that way.
That's what Mississippi taught you. What do you think Freedom Summer teaches the nation, or could teach America now?
It's not such an easy question to really ask. I have sometimes have doubts about all these sort of upper educated Americans going down for very short periods of time and then leaving the people there, not having the permanent stay. I was always much more impressed with those people that put themselves there for years at a time. You wouldn't have to necessarily be there for 10 years, but if you were there for a year, I would think it would have a greater impact on the society than I always felt Mississippi did more for me than I did for Mississippi. I think these experiences open you up to see that it's unfair the way we treat people in our country. That we're a frontier mentality. We're the survival of the fittest mentality. We're more like Australia to some extent, or so that and it's not. You don't have to lose your fun and your ability to live a good life just because you're helping poor people and poor people. I think that there should be a better medical care, obviously, at an earlier age. Obama just put through the national health that we have now. It's very limited. It's all part of the same thing of unfairness. We're not that fair a society, and we can be a fair society, and still those people that somehow want to make money, or they want to sail boats and things. Maybe you don't sail as big a boat. Maybe you don't drive a Ferrari, but you can drive a nice car. So that's how it's affected me to this point in time. I'm older now, you know, it's just, but still, I'm still believing in we're not fair enough in our country by a long shot. You know, I'm left of Obama, let's put it that way.
Do you remember when speaking of that name, the election in 2008, where you were, and did you ever think back in Mississippi that you would see a black president?
I didn't think I'd see a black president.
Mm-hmm.
I was enthralled with the fact that it happened. I don't know if I'm totally that enthralled with Obama now, but not because he's a black president. I think
Mm-hmm.
that, you know, some of the problem is maybe because he's a black president, he was more conservative. He's a professor, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I think he's getting more courageous at the end of his term. You know, he's starting to do things, and that's good. And he's done a lot of great things. You know, he's not very popular right now, so. But you know, he does believe in changing the environment. You know, he, you know, he does believe for medical care for all. Maybe we could do any better. I'm not so sure that Hillary Clinton is going to be, if she ever gets it, is going to be better than Obama. You know, I have a lot of fears of her. She's kind of a hawk. But you know. And we're so polarized now. I mean, it's such a bad place in a way to be an American now compared to, you know, those times, the 60s were very, you know, a time of hope.
Mm-hmm.
Things were going to change. I didn't think there was going to be a physical revolution.
Mm-hmm.
But
you saw change happen.
But the Vietnam War had the huge effect on everybody. I represented people who were connected to the Gold Star mothers then, and you could not believe the power that came out of that. But you know, that's when there's a war and people are being killed all the time. So you know, all these kind of events trigger other things, and then they become part of the society. Hopefully in a positive way. I mean, what I hope really is that the numbers, because of the Hispanics and the minorities, will increase to the point where the voting power will just get greater and greater. Even with the Republican restrictions, they can't stop it. I mean, they really can't stop
That would be
it.
a
The vote is going to do it, you know, and maybe it's not going to happen in my lifetime, but it might happen in my grandchildren's, or, you know, it's not that far away, really, that when those numbers, you know, start to catch up. And you know, what was the Freedom Summer? A lot of it was to get people to vote. I wasn't involved personally in that. I was much more involved in the, you know, more dramatic, you know, the arrests from out of that. But, you know, the kids that came down in numbers, you know, that got people to vote, and that's happening now.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 50 years ago, but the vote is going to be really, it's going to change things once those numbers increase. The birth rate is so much faster than the Caucasians. They just don't have as many children as minorities.
Finally, have you had occasion to go back to Mississippi?
Yeah, I have.
And
I had a case down there. It was not a civil rights case. I had a drug case in the federal court in Jackson, and I went down to Jackson.
when was that?
That must have been 20 years ago, and you know, maybe 20 or 25 years ago, maybe 18, I don't know, something in that range. And experience was okay, you know, it was, I liked being there. It was, you know, Jackson was a pretty nice town, and I wasn't treated badly. In Mississippi, there's so many federal courts. They have them many more than any other place in the country. I don't know how they worked out the district. Most places you get, like, there's the central district, the northern district. In Mississippi, it's like every 20 miles you get another federal,
courthouse.
you know. But Jackson was where I was, and I actually, one of the lawyers that worked with me who grew up in Mississippi, and she came down with me there. So we had a sort of her connection to Mississippi. So that was a pleasant experience.
So that would be 30 years after you'd been there. What changes did you see?
I think in some ways the South, places like Mississippi handled it better than Virginia. that was my sense. Maybe I got it wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but my own sense was they could adapt to the changes in some ways better than places like Virginia that made believe that they were adapting.
Mm.
But they were much more racist, I think, in some ways than Mississippi.
So you saw more integration in.
I wasn't integration as much as a feeling of equality of you know, that I don't know, integration, I wasn't thinking about it because I wasn't exposed to it really, but I just felt there wasn't as much fear and things like that. Now maybe I was wrong and maybe I got a bad view because I was, you know, working out of the federal court in a drug case, typical drug case, nothing that dramatic. Got an okay result, used a pretty well-known local lawyer, so that connected us. You know, the lawyer structure in these smaller places is much more powerful than it is like in Boston, where you know, big deal, you're a lawyer. You know, you and everybody else. Did you go to Harvard? You know what I mean, that kind of thing. Whereas Mississippi, you get more prestige from that. And I felt that when I went down there, like I said, that as a lawyer, you know, these people, everybody was treating me great. Remember, I had practiced for 6 months. It was a nobody. Nobody knew me in Boston, and nobody knew me in Mississippi, and yet in Mississippi, they knew who the lawyers were. And with great respect to us, it made me feel good. You know, people like to feel good. So it was a great experience.